Alright, so as far as the books go now, we're moving on to Nightmares on Dreamscapes. And I don't want to start with the first one in Nightmares on Dreamscapes just yet. We will be getting to that one. But the one I actually wanted to jump into first was the Night Flier, because there's something about this story. First off, the concept is kind of incredible when you really look at it, which is, when you look at the main character in the Night Flier, it basically feels like we're watching a horror story before. It's a story that takes place entirely, like, it starts at the beginning and then reaches its end. It's like we're watching a horror story before the hero ever actually enters it. Which is amazing, because the main character being Richard Dees, this really cutthroat sort of reporter that'll do pretty much anything and everything that's extremely morally questionable in order to get that story for his paper or magazine or whatever you want to call it. And the thing is the cutthroat reporter that's willing to do the morally questionable things in the horror story is usually one of the first to go. So it almost feels like it works perfectly as a short story, because it feels like we're only getting a portion of a bigger story, but it tells just enough to be intriguing and make a great story in itself, especially with its spectacular ending. Like, that was, when you think about them adapting the Night Flier to the screen, like, that's the really tall order. It's probably, in my opinion, probably one of the most awesome endings King's story has ever had. So, being able to adapt that was going to be a tall order in itself. But yeah, so, and talking about it almost being like the cutthroat reporter's usually a side character, if I remember correctly, I want to say Richard Dees also shows up briefly in the Dead Zone, I think it is. And so that just, when you look at the whole, like, King universe, it makes sense anyway. So, to make a movie out of this, a movie that it was made for theaters, but then they ended up releasing it on HBO first, then they put it in theaters. And it was seen as, like, this big disaster as far as its theatrical release, but it's like, well, yeah, that's probably going to happen if you put it on HBO first. But regardless, I believe it still managed to find some sort of cult following, so it does have that. And so, when you look at this story, this really interesting story of this killer of sorts who nobody knows for sure, nobody's seen his face, so nobody knows even if he's human or not, but he has all of the telltale signs of a vampire, and naturally, of course, he has flown in from Derry. Go figure. And when you look at this, it's got this genuinely freaky, antagonist with that, especially when you hear the way he's described, where you can't quite see his face, but he's also got the cape, where the way they describe it in the story is the inside is red as a fire engine, and the outside is black as a woodchuck's asshole. And I'm so glad that they kept that when they adapted it into script form, and we do end up getting that line. A lot of the lines do end up carrying over. But another thing that that's kind of nice as far as thinking about adapting this story to screen is that for a short story, they throw a lot of character names at us, and sometimes that can be a lot to juggle within the confines of the story and how fast it's kind of moving as they're talking about the different victims. So it was kind of nice to be able to see the movie and see, like, see those victims alive for at least a little bit, and then actually see what happened to them. Sometimes we get to see it happen as it's happening, sometimes it's done in flashback form, but either way, it still works. So, and especially, like, the old couple, they add, like, a lot more creepy pieces to that story, how the wife is, like, practically not there at all, and then the same thing that happened with Buck, where it's like, or Claire, it would be, the first guy that's murdered, the guy that was murdered before the story started, that we see in flashback, and how they just kind of linger around afterwards, and it's like before their bodies are found in their worst state. And there's definitely something creepy, like, in the story itself, the way it was adapted, that really works. And then, like, even to the point where sometimes it carries over from the story, where, like, if you were to just see the movie by itself, it may not have that factor, but there's something about, like, when you read the story and you become familiar with the Night Flier's number on his plane, and it's like that's not something you really pay attention to otherwise, but because if you're familiar with the story and you get to know that number, the first time we get a shot of it, when the plane is just sitting there in the opening scene of the movie, it's already really creepy because we know what it means. So stuff like that carries over nicely if you're familiar enough with the story. And then we get the whole thing where we get his introduction, Deez's introduction, and we get to see just how, for lack of a better way to put it, how bad of a person he can be if he really, really wants to get something or get a particular story or a particular picture. And so we've got this whole thing where he goes into the editor's office, which is a really nice touch. I don't know if it's intentional or not, but he goes into the editor's office while the opening titles are happening. So as he reaches the editor's door, the credit for the film editor comes up. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but it's a nice touch regardless. So when he goes into the editor's office, he's talking about this dead baby that he got a picture of, that he went into a morgue and actually took. Whether he had permission to do that, we don't know. I'm going to assume not. And it's this thing, it's like they've taken like his entire life away from him by editing that picture out of the story. And that's just immediately sets the ground for that. And it also sets the ground for a character that, if I remember correctly, the movie introduces that is not in the short story. And that is the other, I guess you could say, co-lead in the movie with Catherine. And I was talking about how it's like, oh, the light bulb's going out. That's a great story to be talking about as the lights are going out. If that bulb gives out, it's going to get darker, and that's going to be hopefully not too fucked up. So I was talking with the other movies, like Graveyard Shift and The Mangler, how when you see the cast lists for these movies, a lot of them didn't really go on to other bigger things. And in Catherine's particular case, it's kind of, I mean, I suppose it's probably nothing if you look into it. But with the fact that it's a movie like this, there's almost an eerie quality to the fact that apparently that actress was never in anything else but this. Apparently she was like an extra in and Out, I think. And then apart from that, after 1997, she just vanished without a trace. And that's just an IMDb page. I'm sure there's information. Maybe she retired or did something else, or maybe acting wasn't her thing or what. But yeah, so there is that. And I do understand why they put her character in this, I guess, to kind of show the... So especially with the way they've changed the ending, eventually we get to this point where it kind of comes full circle of we see where they start off. Because there's the whole thing where... when it seems like when you start off, they set up this thing where when you start off at this paper, only one of two things is going to happen. You're either going to turn into a Deez, or you're going to turn into this person, Dottie, who supposedly committed suicide, and who's only mentioned briefly in the book, and they barely go into it. And this one kind of fleshes that out a little bit more. And I guess with the Catherine character, they kind of set that up a little bit more to kind of have a theme going on and sort of like a commentary on the whole, bloodthirsty journalism sort of thing. Journalism, whatever you want to call it. You may use that term loosely, but... and there are some great things they do here, but there are also cases where it looked like they were going in one direction, and I wish they had stuck with that one direction instead of kind of doing another thing. Because one of the great moments in the story is at that end moment when Renfield tells him, the very cleverly named Dwight Renfield tells him, I've been watching you and I know what you've been doing and all that stuff. And the movie plays with that understandably and, has him, send him the messages and stuff like that and lets him know that he's being followed. But it seems like the first time he becomes aware of this is the moment where he puts the blood on, is it Claire's headstone, I think? And as soon as he does that, there's like a connection thing. It has that very 90s editing to show us that Renfield senses that this has happened, and that's how he knows that what Deez is doing. And it kind of sucks the scene went in that direction, because it's kind of like, not only does it now make Renfield aware, we're aware early that Renfield knows what Deez is doing at all times, because of this whole connection thing. But what I liked about this scene before it went into that was the idea of, we already had the dead baby scene to kind of set up where Dees is and where his motivations are. And it was like a whole new level of, well, maybe not to a similar extent. One may not seem as extreme as the other, but when he goes into the cemetery and he wants to take a picture of the headstone, and he decides that it's not creepy enough. So he cuts himself to put his own blood on it to make it look like it's just a bloody headstone. And like that in itself would have been this amazing scene to show how morally fucked this guy is. But then to do all that, it was like, I felt like it kind of took away from that sort of character moment, to say, oh no, it's actually this thing is why we're doing this, and it's like, oh, alright, I guess. So there's that. But it does have those other moments. There is a moment when they kind of go, I'm assuming intentionally, into Cujo territory. It kind of feels like an intentional callback to that, where he goes outside the diner or whatever it is, I can't remember exactly, and that dog is just kind of lurking on the roof of this building, like waiting for him, and it's just kind of stalking around. And there's stuff like that, the stuff they throw in to make it feel more like, almost like kind of like the way we feel about Derry and It, where it feels like the entire town almost feels like it's looking like he's always being watched from somewhere, or there's anything that could potentially attack him. I do like them being able to capture the feel like that, or like I was saying with the people who are attacked and then just sort of walk around almost zombie-like. There is something with that, and probably the most genuinely creepy moment in the movie would be when he's in his motel and he's sleeping and he wakes up, and the way they kind of shot this and made this scene where, much like Dees, we're not quite sure what we're looking at immediately. We have in our minds what it could be, or what the movie would, or the makers would want us to think it is, but we're not quite sure if that is really what we're looking at or not. And the way the cloak sort of starts to finally take shape after a while, and then we realize it's the shape of Renfield right behind the curtain. Not on the outside, but right behind the fucking curtain. And it's this really great moment, and it does the whole, he lunges and it's a dream sequence thing, but that's a lot more effective than a lot of the dream sequence things. And then, of course, it's just kind of an added-on thing that, oh, he really was there, but he was, It's kind of hard to tell if the writing that says stay away is on the inside or the outside of the window. I don't remember that being confirmed, but either way, I suppose it works. But I think the dream sequence in itself worked by itself, rather than having to go that full round and say, oh, he actually was in there and stuff like that. But I already made it apparent how I feel about the whole, we know early on that he knows where he is and all that, because it kind of takes away from the impact of the ending when he says that. But for the most part, that stuff works. Only every now and then is there like a directorial flourish where it's like, I don't think that completely works. Like, I feel like it probably looked better in their heads or on paper than it did in execution. Like, the transition when she's pissed off that Dees has taken the story back, so she rips up her plane ticket and throws it in the air. But it when she throws it in the air, it goes into slow-mo and all three people look up, and then it transitions to the sky and a plane. I don't know what that was supposed to be. It doesn't look that great, and I don't know what they were going for, but I at least get the sense that they were going for something, it just didn't quite pan out. But that's only really one of the few of those that happens. For the most part, it's pretty well handled and actually looks good, and when they want to go for that eerie vibe, more often than not they can find it. But then we get to the ending, and I get what they wanted to do. I am pleased that we do get the scene, the big scene that's in the story when he's in the bathroom and he never quite gets a look at him. Like, he's afraid to turn around and he's clearly not reflected in the mirror, so he just has to listen to him, and then he just takes his film and says, don't follow me or you'll end up like everybody else in the room. And then he just leaves, and it's such a perfect ending. It's creepy, it doesn't show too much, and then it's got that final thing where it's like, the cops show up, and it looks like Dees might get taken down, because he looks very suspicious being around all the dead bodies with nobody else around, because Renfield's long gone at this point. And the ending that we imagine is the ending that the movie gave. Like, as soon as the cops show up and see Dees around all the bodies, with the bodies all around him, we imagine the ending of the movie in our heads. But I like that the story just stops that, and he just, shows his credentials and says, "I'm Press Dickface," and that's such a great ending. And so I get what they were trying to do when they changed the ending, or not really changed the ending, but they continue after the ending. And so when I was talking about with the fact that this is a movie where the hero never shows up, so somehow this, even though he's not the hero, I guess you could say he's the protagonist at least. To give him some sort of comeuppance because he is a piece of shit. I don't know. I think the fact that he shows us just how much it matters to him to have the picture and have the story, and that is his life. To take the film out of his camera when he has his ultimate story, I feel like is enough to bring him down. And the fact that the story hints at the fact that the image of Renfield pissing into the urinal is burned in his brain forever, and it's going to give him nightmares forever. So at the end of the story, he's going to be a tortured soul forever, regardless. But the movie wanted to take it just a little bit farther and have him confronted with all the past victims of his stories and all that stuff. And like I said, I get what they were going for. And the fact that he does end up being killed by the cops, and I'm sure there's some intentional visual cue with one of the shots being to his neck, of course. And then ultimately him becoming the story. Like, I really get what they were going for, and I think in another, like, if I wasn't familiar with the story, that would probably be, like, a really great ending. And for a movie, yeah, it does work. But I do feel like the movie could have pulled off the ending of the story and stopping it where it did. And to the point that, like, the whole thing is, there's, like, a whole point to be made about the fact that he never sees Renfield's face. And the way, even with, the short story not being a visual medium, still the visuals it puts in your head of that, to where it, like, obscures his face at all times, is still so well done and really tells that story in a great way. And the fact that not only do we see his face in the movie, a whole segment of this scene is devoted to him showing his face. It's like, Renfield's getting ready to leave, and he's like, "Dude, show me your face." And then he makes a whole big deal. He walks like Silva and Skyfall up to him the whole way. And then this face is revealed. The face they were so confident in, it's the DVD cover. So there's no hiding anything at all. And I think that takes away from it quite a bit. So yeah, I feel like they definitely could have done the short story ending, and it still would have been, it could have been very cinematic. But, I guess they wanted to just take it that step further. And then, of course, talking about how Dees has been in more than one King story, it is worth noting the story right after the Night Flier in Nightmares on Dreamscapes being Popsy, which is the kid's grandfather that ultimately ends up being a vampire, and King actually hints in the notes at the end of the book that he likes to think that they're the same one. They're the same vampire. So I like the idea of that, because to my understanding, they did want to make, like, King collaborated with the director of the Night Flier, and they conjured up a whole sequel that would follow, like, Catherine, but I guess just nobody wanted to finance it, nobody wanted to do it, and I can agree with the people that were like, no, we don't need to do that. It probably was it wasn't a financial success thing, but even from a story perspective, it's like, I don't know, it's, as far as the movie goes, the ending they came up with, even if I prefer the story's ending, the movie's ending is good enough to stand on its own, that you don't need to add to it on top of that. So that's pretty much where I stand with this. So I don't think the movie quite does the story justice, but I also think that the story is also one of those stories that its defining moment is its ending, where, like, it's kind of just another story for a while as it goes, and it's like, it's got an interesting setup, and like I said, the way Renfield is described as almost like this sort of phantom type thing with a Dracula cloak is really interesting, but the ending is absolutely what sells it. Like I said, one of the most badass endings to a King story, I think. So, but the movie did what it did, and I understand the changes that were made to an extent, even if I don't think they're totally necessary. So, yeah, they did perfectly fine with this. So, I think that's where I'm going to leave that. Not entirely sure what the next one will be, but obviously it'll be figured out very soon. And then there'll be more verses and all that, and whenever the hell another review video is, we'll find out together. So until all that other stuff, I think that's it for this.